In the fall of 1553, a young prince, adored across the vast lands of an empire, rode across the wide plains of Anatolia toward his father's encampment. His heart was calm. He believed in mercy. He believed that loyalty and shared blood would outweigh whispers and palace conspiracies. He trusted that a son could still find justice in the presence of his father. What awaited him, however, was not reconciliation. It was not forgiveness. It was a carefully prepared snare, crafted in silence by figures who once wore chains and now held the levers of imperial fate. When Prince Mustafa stepped inside the private chamber, he found his father seated, unmoving, an arrow resting in his grasp. Mustafa bowed with deep respect. Then the sentence was spoken. From behind the curtains emerged 7 mute executioners, trained men who spoke only through death. Silken bowstrings hung from their hands. Mustafa resisted. He struck 2 of them down. For a brief moment, escape seemed possible. But more arms closed in. The cord tightened around his throat. Breath disappeared. Strength faded. And when his body collapsed onto the Persian carpets beyond the veil, the gaze of the most powerful ruler on earth remained unchanged. The air was dead. When word spread through the military camp, the silence that followed was brief. Then it shattered. Thousands of janissaries, elite soldiers sworn to protect that very prince, erupted in fury. Tents were ripped apart. Weapons were seized. The empire itself seemed to tremble. And far away within the gilded chambers of Constantinople, a woman with copper-colored hair allowed herself a quiet smile. She had once been property. She had been taken from her homeland, sold in slave markets, and dragged across continents into the heart of Ottoman power. Yet without lifting a blade, she had eliminated the empire's chosen successor. The consequences of that day would echo for centuries, marking the moment when the greatest empire of its era began to weaken from within. To understand how a captive woman could destroy a prince, one must first understand the world that shaped her. By the mid-16th century, the Ottoman Empire was more than a state. It was a superpower. Its territory stretched from the edges of Vienna to the deserts of Egypt, from the Balkan Mountains to the shores of the Red Sea. Constantinople, once the crown jewel of Eastern Rome, had fallen into its hands. Ottoman fleets ruled the Mediterranean. Its ruler was spoken of as the shadow of God on earth. At the center of this immense realm stood Sultan Süleyman, known in Europe as the Magnificent, and to his own people as Kanuni, the lawgiver. He was both conqueror and poet, warrior and legislator. Under his reign, the empire reached its greatest size. Belgrade fell. Rhodes surrendered. Hungary was crushed at Mohacs. Across Europe, fear followed his banners. Yet inside the walls of Topkapi Palace, a different conflict unfolded. This war used no armies. It was fought through glances, whispered alliances, and calculated betrayals. The imperial harem was not a place of indulgence. It was the true political core of the empire. Future rulers were born there. Lives were spared or erased there. Ottoman custom was merciless but precise. Each concubine was permitted only one son by the sultan. Once the child matured, mother and son were sent to govern a distant province. Upon the sultan's death, his sons would fight for the throne. The victor ruled. The defeated were strangled with silk cords, preserving royal blood from touching the ground. It was a savage system, but it worked. It prevented civil war. It ensured that only the most capable survived. For generations, the dynasty followed this law, until one woman chose to break it. She arrived in Constantinople around 1520, the same year Suleiman took the throne. Her original name is uncertain. Some records suggest Alexandra, others Anastasia. History remembers her as Roxolana, the Ruthenian, a name reflecting the Slavic lands from which she was taken. She was born around 1505 in Rahatin, in what is now western Ukraine, likely the daughter of an Orthodox priest. Her youth ended suddenly when raiders captured her, selling her into slavery and transporting her to the Ottoman capital. What followed would alter the course of an empire forever. Her childhood ended the moment Crimean Tatar raiders descended upon her village. The attack was swift and merciless. Homes burned. Families were torn apart. She was taken alive, bound in chains and forced onto the long road south. From the muddy paths of her homeland, she was marched to the slave markets of Kaffa on the Crimean Peninsula, one of the largest human trading hubs of the Black Sea world. From there, she crossed the sea to Constantinople, where she was sold into the imperial harem itself. She was no more than 15 or 16 years old. By Ottoman standards, her appearance was unusual. Her hair carried a reddish glow, her skin was pale, her features foreign. She was not considered the most striking beauty among the concubines. What set her apart was something far rarer. Her mind was sharp. Her instincts were precise. And her will refused to bend, even in a place designed to erase individuality. Inside the harem, she was given a new name, Hurrem, the joyful one, the one who laughs. It was not irony. It was recognition. While other captives mourned their pasts in silence, Hurrem adapted. She learned the Turkish language with speed. She mastered court manners. She studied the invisible architecture of power, who commanded loyalty, who merely wore authority, and who could be replaced without consequence. She did not rush. She observed. And she waited. Her moment arrived through the young ruler of the empire. Sultan Süleyman was only 26 when he noticed the red-haired slave. What drew him in was not beauty alone. It was her wit, her confidence. She laughed easily. She challenged him with words. She responded to his poetry with verses of her own. In a court where women existed as possessions, she spoke as though she belonged beside him, not beneath him. What followed was unprecedented. Süleyman did not simply favor her. He became deeply attached to her. And that attachment would push him to dismantle customs his dynasty had obeyed for centuries. The first rupture came when Hurrem bore him more than one son. Then another still. Within less than 10 years she gave birth to 6 children, 5 boys and a daughter. The ancient rule of one concubine, one male heir was obliterated. Courtiers murmured. Scholars objected. The palace trembled. The Sultan ignored them all. Then came the greater shock. Around 1534, Süleyman did what no Ottoman ruler had done before. He formally freed Hurrem from slavery and married her. Not symbolically, legally, publicly. For the first time in Ottoman history, a woman taken from the harem became the Sultan's lawful wife. A new title was created solely for her, Haseki Sultan, imperial consort, a role that had never existed until she filled it. The transformation was absolute. The girl captured on the plains of Ruthenia now stood as the most powerful woman in the Islamic world. Her daily stipend made her one of the wealthiest individuals in the empire. She exchanged letters with European monarchs. She sponsored mosques, hospitals, schools, and charitable foundations. Her influence reached into decisions of state once reserved exclusively for men. But power demands a price. And that price would be paid by someone who never chose to stand in her way. Prince Mustafa had been born in 1515, years before Hurrem ever arrived in Constantinople. His mother, Mahidevran, was of Circassian or Albanian origin and had once been Süleyman's favored consort. When Süleyman ascended the throne in 1520, Mustafa was his only surviving son. His position as heir was unquestioned. The empire watched him grow with expectation. He was intelligent, disciplined, charismatic. At 16, following long-standing tradition, he was sent to govern the province of Manisa, a training ground for future sultans. There he excelled. He ruled with fairness. He commanded troops with confidence. He wrote poetry under the name Malisi. The Janissaries admired him deeply. The population respected him. Foreign envoys openly described him as the ideal successor to Süleyman. But while Mustafa strengthened his reputation in the provinces, Hurrem fortified her position in the capital. And she understood one unalterable truth of Ottoman succession. If Mustafa became sultan, her sons would die. Tradition allowed no mercy. When a new ruler ascended the throne, his brothers were executed to secure stability. So courts, silent rooms, finality. If Mustafa lived to rule, Hurrem's children would be eliminated one by one. The rivalry between Hurrem and Mahidevran became infamous. Stories spread of confrontations inside the harem, claws, torn hair, restrained by guards. Whether exaggerated or not, the result was undeniable. Mahidevran was gradually stripped of influence, isolated, and pushed to the margins of power. And from that moment onward, the fate of Prince Mustafa was no longer a question of if, but when. Mahidevran was gradually removed from the center of power, compelled to follow her son into distant provincial posts while Hurrem remained firmly beside Suleiman in Constantinople. But isolating the mother was not enough. As long as Prince Mustafa lived, the danger to Hurrem's children endured. And Hurrem was not a woman who allowed dangers to remain unresolved. Her greatest instrument was a man named Rustam Pasha. Rustam had not been born into power. He entered the empire through the Devshirme system, the levy that took Christian boys from the Balkans and reshaped them into servants of the Ottoman state. Born in Bosnia, converted, educated, and hardened by court life, Rustam climbed the imperial hierarchy with remarkable speed. In 1539, his rise became irreversible when he married Muraima Sultan, the only daughter of Suleiman and Hurrem. With that union, Rustam became the Sultan's son-in-law and, by extension, the natural ally of the most powerful woman in the empire. 5 years later, in 1544, he was appointed Grand Vizier, the highest office beneath the Sultan himself. From that moment on, Hurrem possessed something she had never had before: direct control over the machinery of the state. Through Rustam, she had access to reports, correspondence, military intelligence, and provincial administration across the empire. Together, mother-in-law and son-in-law began constructing the snare that would destroy Prince Mustafa. Their plan was not open confrontation. It was something far more effective. They would poison Suleiman's trust. By this time, the Sultan was over 60 years old. His health was declining. Pain plagued him. The court whispered constantly about his mortality. And with those whispers came a terrifying question. What would happen if the heir decided not to wait? Rustam began feeding the Sultan carefully crafted warnings. He claimed the Janissaries were growing restless, eager for a younger ruler to lead them into battle. He insisted that soldiers were traveling to Amasya, where Mustafa governed, to pledge personal loyalty to the prince. He hinted that Mustafa was behaving like a man already preparing to rule. Then came the most dangerous accusation of all. Rustam alleged that Mustafa was secretly corresponding with Shah Tahmasp of Persia, the ruler of the Safavid Empire and the Ottomans' most persistent rival. Letters were produced. Seals appeared. Messages suggested coordination, ambition, betrayal. Some elements contained truth. Mustafa was immensely popular with the army. Soldiers did admire him. They did hope to see him on the throne one day. But the claims of treason, conspiracy, and collusion with Persia were inventions. Documents were forged. Witnesses were bribed. Evidence was manufactured with precision. The decisive moment came in the summer of 1553. Suleiman was preparing for another campaign against the Safavids. Rustam departed ahead of the main force, then sent urgent messages back to the Sultan. He warned that unrest was spreading through the ranks. He claimed soldiers were demanding Mustafa as commander. He suggested that the prince was on the verge of seizing power. None of it was true. But decades of suspicion, carefully cultivated fear, and Hurrem's constant influence had eroded Suleiman's judgment. He believed the reports. The Sultan summoned the leading religious jurists and requested a legal ruling. A fatwa was issued, declaring that a son who rebelled against his father could lawfully be executed. Once the justification was secured, Suleiman sent a summons. Prince Mustafa was ordered to present himself at the imperial military camp near Iregli, close to Konya. When Mustafa received the command, he hesitated. His advisors urged caution. His mother, Mahidevran, pleaded with him not to go. She sensed the danger immediately. She personally prepared all of her son's food, fearing poison. She begged him to remain in the province. But refusal would confirm the accusations. To stay away would make him appear guilty. To go meant risking death. Mustafa chose honor. He mounted his horse and set out to meet his father, convinced that he could speak for himself, that truth would prevail, that blood would outweigh deception. He arrived at the camp on October 5th. His reception was ceremonial. Officers greeted him respectfully. Gifts were exchanged. There was no sign of hostility. The following day at midday, Mustafa rode toward his father's pavilion. The Sultan's tent was enormous, divided into multiple chambers and draped in layers of silk. According to protocol, Mustafa dismounted and surrendered his weapons before entering. His attendants remained behind, unarmed and unaware. Alone, he passed through the curtains into the inner chamber. Suleiman sat inside, silent and rigid, an arrow resting in his hand. His expression revealed nothing, no anger, no affection, no hesitation. Mustafa bowed deeply, preparing to greet his father. Then the words fell like a sentence carved in stone. Before he could respond, the shadows moved. 7 figures emerged from behind the curtains. They were mute executioners, chosen precisely because they could not speak or cry out. In their hands were bowstrings of horsehair, the traditional instrument of royal death. Mustafa fought. At 38 years old, at the peak of his strength, he resisted fiercely. He struck down 2 of the attackers. For a brief moment, escape seemed possible. But the others closed in. The cord tightened. Breath vanished. Strength drained away. And as the heir of the empire collapsed onto the carpets of his father's tent, the Sultan did not intervene. Even without weapons, Mustafa was a dangerous opponent. He was in his physical prime, trained for war since childhood, and his strength made him formidable. He struck back with desperation and precision, knocking 2 of the attackers to the ground. For a fleeting moment he broke free. He lunged toward the opening of the tent. Freedom was only steps away. Then fate closed in. One of the executioners, a renowned palace wrestler named Zal Mahmud Aga, seized him from behind. The bowstring looped around Mustafa's neck. Others rushed forward, tightening their grip. As air was crushed from his lungs, Mustafa's eyes turned toward his father. Suleiman watched. He did not speak. He did not rise. He did not command them to stop. He remained still as his eldest son, the prince adored by soldiers and citizens alike, was strangled within arm's reach. When Mustafa's body finally went limp, the executioners dragged him outside and laid him upon a Persian carpet before the imperial tent. The message was unmistakable. Authority still lived. The Sultan still ruled. But the message fell upon men who refused to accept it. A sound rose from within the camp. First a single cry, then another, then dozens, then thousands. The Janissaries, the elite corps of the Ottoman army, erupted in outrage. They had marched with Mustafa. They had bled beside him. He was not merely a prince to them, he was the leader they trusted, the ruler they wanted. Now he was dead, destroyed by palace conspiracies born in the harem. Anger spread like fire. Tents were ripped apart. Bonfires blazed across the camp. Armed groups surged toward the Sultan's pavilion demanding justice. Others shouted one name over and over, calling for the execution of Rustam Pasha. The army camp became a powder keg. Suleiman, who had confronted kings and crushed empires, felt fear, not of foreign enemies but of his own soldiers. He moved swiftly. That very night, Rustam Pasha was stripped of his position as Grand Vizier. The announcement was made publicly. A sacrifice had been offered. It worked, partially. The rebellion did not explode. But the wound remained open. The soldiers never forgot. When news reached Constantinople, unrest followed. Crowds gathered. Palace walls echoed with anger and grief. Poets composed laments that would endure for generations. Taslikali Yehya wrote verses that still survive, crying out that the world had lost one of its pillars, that death's executioners had claimed Prince Mustafa Khan. Across Anatolia, Mustafa was remembered not as a traitor, but as a martyr. In popular memory, he became the victim of intrigue, destroyed by a foreign woman who had ensnared the Sultan's heart. Hurrem achieved her goal. Her sons were safe. With Mustafa gone, only Selim and Bayezid, her surviving eldest sons, remained as contenders for the throne. There is no record that she expressed regret. 5 years later, in April 1558, she died in Constantinople, surrounded by immense wealth and unquestioned power, never having faced punishment for what she had set in motion. But history is rarely merciful. The sons for whom a prince had been sacrificed proved unworthy of the cost. Bayezid, the more capable of the two, rebelled against his brother Selim in 1559, plunging Anatolia into chaos. The civil war devastated cities and provinces. Defeated, Bayezid fled to Persia seeking refuge. He was eventually surrendered to the Ottomans. In 1561, Bayezid was strangled by order of his own father. His 4 sons were executed alongside him. A 5th child, only 3 years old, left behind in Bursa, was hunted down and killed later. Only Selim remained. And Selim was everything Mustafa had not been. When Suleiman died in 1566 during the siege of Sigidvar in Hungary, Selim too inherited the most powerful empire on earth. But where his father had been a warrior, a legislator, and a poet, Selim was a hedonist. He favored wine over warfare, pleasure over duty. Europeans called him Selim the Sot. Among his own people he became known as Selim the Drunkard. He never led troops into battle. He inspired no devotion among soldiers. Governance was delegated almost entirely to his Grand Vizier, Sokalu Mehmed Pasha, while Selim withdrew into the indulgences of the palace. In 1574 his life ended in humiliation. He slipped on the wet floor of an unfinished bathhouse, struck his head and died. Yet before his ignoble death, Selim presided over a moment that symbolized the transformation of the Ottoman Empire. In 1571, the Ottoman fleet was shattered at the Battle of Lepanto by a coalition of Christian powers. It was the first catastrophic naval defeat the empire had suffered in more than a century. The illusion of invincibility was gone. The empire that had once terrified the world had begun its long decline, one that many historians trace back to a single moment in 1553, when a father watched in silence as his greatest son was murdered before his eyes. The Ottomans rebuilt their navy with astonishing speed, replacing ships and sailors in record time. Yet something essential had been lost. The aura of inevitability was gone. The world had seen that the giant could bleed. The empire still stood tall, but observers now sensed weakness beneath the armor. The colossus, it seemed, stood on fragile foundations. For centuries afterward, scholars would argue over whether the execution of Prince Mustafa truly marked the beginning of Ottoman decline. No single event can destroy an empire of such scale. And yet, the alignment of events is impossible to dismiss. The first 10 Ottoman sultans had been warriors, administrators, and rulers who commanded genuine authority. With Selim too, a different pattern emerged, a succession of rulers who were pliable, detached, and increasingly absorbed by palace life rather than governance. There was another inheritance from that October day, subtler yet far more corrosive. Hurrem's sultan had not only eliminated a rival. She had created a precedent. She demonstrated that a woman of the imperial harem could influence succession, remove heirs, and shape the destiny of states without ever stepping onto a battlefield. Later generations absorbed the lesson. The period stretching roughly from the mid-16th century to the early 18th century would later be labeled the Sultanate of Women. During this era, mothers, wives, and favored consorts exercised extraordinary influence over Ottoman politics. Some acted as capable regents, preserving stability during the reigns of child sultans. Others exploited their position for vengeance, enrichment, and intrigue. The centralized authority that had once been the empire's greatest strength began to fracture. Court factions multiplied. Grand viziers rose and fell at the whims of palace politics. The janissaries, once an elite and disciplined force, became a volatile power bloc that deposed rulers when dissatisfied. The empire did not collapse overnight. It endured for more than 3 centuries after Mustafa's death. But it never regained the vitality of its early age. Expansion slowed, then stopped. Borders stabilized, then retreated. And when historians searched for the moment when the tide first shifted, many traced it back to a single afternoon in Anatolia in October 1553, when a father chose fear over trust and sacrificed his son to the schemes of a former slave. Mustafa was buried in Bursa, the old Ottoman capital, in a tomb commissioned by order of his grandfather. Yet the most striking tribute came from an unexpected source. When Selim II ascended the throne, the very man who benefited most from Mustafa's death, he restored the honor of Mahidevran, Mustafa's mother, who had lived in poverty and obscurity after her son's execution. Selim also ordered the construction of a proper mausoleum for the brother he had barely known. Perhaps it was guilt. Perhaps it was acknowledgement. Perhaps Selim himself understood that he would never equal the man whose place he had taken. Suleiman lived 13 years after ordering his son's death. He continued to campaign. He continued to write poetry. Yet those close to him noticed a change. His victories brought less satisfaction. His trust in others diminished. A heaviness followed him, one that triumph could not erase. Some claimed he slept poorly. Others whispered that he replayed the final moments of Mustafa's life in his mind, again and again. The great Sultan died in 1566, at the age of 72, during the siege of a Hungarian fortress. His death was concealed from the army to prevent disorder until victory was secured. Only afterward was his body carried back to Constantinople. He was laid to rest beside Hurrem Sultan, the woman he had loved more deeply than tradition allowed, in a magnificent mausoleum attached to the Suleymani Mosque. They remain there still, the conqueror and the captive, the lawgiver and the strategist, united in death as they had been in life. If the dead could speak, perhaps a single question would echo among the stone walls. Was it worth it? Time moved on. Empires rose and fell. The Ottoman state itself vanished in 1922, replaced by the modern Turkish Republic. Yet the story of Suleiman, Hurrem, and Mustafa refused to fade. As early as 1561, only 8 years after the execution, the French playwright Gabriel Bounin wrote a tragedy inspired by the affair, marking the first appearance of Ottoman figures on a European stage. Since then, the tale has been retold endlessly, in plays, operas, novels, and, in modern times, television series watched by millions across the world. Each era finds a different meaning within it. To some, it is a warning about ambition without restraint. To others, it is a study of female power within a system designed to deny it. For many, it is simply a human tragedy, a father destroying what he loved most out of terror of losing control. Yet perhaps the deepest lesson lies elsewhere. It lies in how a single decision, made behind silk curtains on an autumn afternoon, can ripple through centuries. In how choices forged at the center of power reverberate far beyond those who make them. In how love, when fused with fear, can become something monstrous. Hurrem Sultan was a survivor. Torn from her home. Sold as property. Forced to navigate a world designed to crush her. She did not merely endure, she prevailed. She rose from enslavement to queenship. She shaped imperial policy. She altered the structure of Ottoman power forever. And yet, her victory was built upon the destruction of a man who had done her no personal harm. That is the paradox history cannot resolve. We admire her intelligence while condemning her ruthlessness. We recognize her strength while mourning her victims. She was innovator and destroyer, heroine and villain all at once. Perhaps that is why her story endures. It offers no comfort. It provides no clear verdict. It forces us to confront the complexity of ambition and the terrible cost exacted from those caught in its path. History flows onward like a river. Thrones rise and fall. Empires emerge from the ruins of their predecessors. And in every age there is another Hurrem plotting ascent, another Mustafa trusting too deeply, another ruler choosing fear over love. The tent where it happened no longer stands. The Anatolian plain has changed countless times since that distant October. Yet on a quiet autumn afternoon, when the wind moves down from the mountains and the light begins to fade, one might still sense something lingering there, an echo. The echo of a prince who entered a tent seeking his father's embrace and found only death waiting in the shadows. And in that silence lies the final truth of the story. Empires are built of stone and steel, but they are undone by what resides in human hearts. The strongest fortress can fall to betrayal. Love, when poisoned by fear, becomes the deadliest weapon of all. The slave triumphed. The prince died. The empire began to weaken. And the echo of that day still crosses the centuries, reminding every generation that the greatest battles are not always fought on open fields, but in quiet chambers, where families destroy themselves in the name of power.